And welcome back to another episode of Real Talk Youth Ministry with Josh and Caleb. We're here to talk about honest conversations about what works and what doesn't work. And today we are your hosts. I am Josh.
And I'm Caleb. And today we've got a great episode. It is all about blueprints, models, and structures in youth ministry. We're going to talk about different approaches to doing that, and what we've seen work and what we've seen not, some challenges we've seen with those, and some mistakes we've learned along the way.
Yeah. And if you're a youth minister, a volunteer, a chaperone, a deacon, an elder, or you're just someone who really cares about discipling the next young generation, this episode is really for you. We're going to be breaking down several models of youth ministry, three in particular, how they function, their strengths, their weaknesses, and how you can decide what works best for your group. And so that's what we're going to do today. So let's jump right into it.
Before we get into the specific models, we need to have a framework on why structure even matters to begin with, right? So Josh, why don't you tell us, why is it important to have structure?
It's a great question. Without a model, you're basically just throwing things together and hoping it works, hoping it sticks, kind of like when you're sitting there making food, kind of putting all the seasoning in, just hoping that it tastes good, That's kind of what youth ministry is. A good model gives direction, right? It helps volunteers stay on the same page, ensures that you're actually discipling your students instead of just entertaining them. I saw what you did there. I know what you tried to do. It's okay. Hey, let's be completely honest, all right? Caleb, you can probably agree with me. Without a plan, things get very chaotic very quickly, right?
Yeah.
I've seen ministries that are running from one event to the next without any long-term vision, and that right there is simply exhausting. Not just for the youth minister, but it's exhausting for the students too, because you're having one after the next, and there's no discipling.
That's right.
You're burning yourself out almost. There needs to be consistency, and there needs to be a purpose for what we're doing in our youth ministry.
That's right. And I think far too often we fall into the trap of doing what we've always done without stepping back and saying, is this what is best for the congregation, to reach my students, to reach the community? And we get into this routine of, well, I've always done this, without thinking critically about how do we reach students. Does that make sense?
It does.
And here's the thing, Josh. We've both seen ministries, and both of us try to do and have ministries that incorporate everything. And while that might seem like a good idea, I think sometimes we try to do too much of everything. Does it, and that leads to burnout, it leads to confusion, it leads to chaos. So structure matters because it gives us a strategy, but it also gives us direction too.
Yes.
And it allows us to be super intentional with our ministries.
Yes. When you have a model in place, it also helps when there's leadership changes. Let's be completely honest. Youth ministry is constantly evolving. I've heard someone say, I don't remember who it was, but someone said that ministers are disposable, right? Ministers are always leaving. They're always going somewhere different. Other ministers are coming back to different churches. It's always happening. That's an inevitable. It's going to happen. If your youth minister moves, or a key volunteer decides to step down, or your deacon steps down, there's a foundation in place so that ministry doesn't just fall apart. It doesn't just sit there and crumble. And so now we have to establish why these models are important and all that. So let's dive right into it.
First up is the discipleship model. This is the one that's about small groups. It's about mentoring, deep personal and spiritual growth, one-on-one connections, smaller in feel. You know what I mean?
Right. Instead of focusing on a big event or, trying to hype something up, this model really, like you said, it emphasizes on the one-on-one. Having one-on-one relationships, one-on-one Bible studies, one-on-one accountability. It's about depth over breadth. You're not just packing a room full of kids. You're investing in a few at a time in a very meaningful way. And honestly, this is probably the model that we closely reflects how Jesus did ministry, right? He had 12 disciples. We all know that. But even within that, he had Peter, James, and John, which was his core group. So,
Yeah. And here's the thing. I've seen this work with I've seen this work really well in churches where the leaders will invest in a few students at a time, and those students go and disciple and invest in other students, right? So it's this idea of 2 Timothy 2:2, and it's teaching others who will teach others. And when you do it right, it creates a ripple effect where students don't just grow while they're in youth group, but they grow and they carry this disciple mindset throughout their entire life, right? It is literally a life-changing model.
I agree. Side fun fact for you. So in the youth group, we had this shirt, and we had an event. Well, it was a retreat called the Ripple Effect. That T-shirt was my favorite one. Jared, if you're watching this, that was my favorite shirt. All right, but let's be completely real. This model can be tough at times. You have to be intentional. You know, your one-on-one time. If you spend one-on-one time, that's great and all, but you have to be intentional about it. You can't just rely on a Wednesday night lesson either, and call it discipleship. Okay,
That's right.
it requires mentoring. It requires those conversations outside of the church. It requires real accountability. And personally, I've started that with my group. I have a really good group of boys, and I'm going to boast about my boys because I love my kids. I've started this one-on-one thing where I take one or two of them. We'll go out to eat, come back to my house. I got a pool table at the house. We'll sit there and play some pool. Then we'll have a Bible study. We'll pray, and then I say, hey, I'll see y'all next time. That kind of stuff. Like just kind of squeezing in those one-on-one times anywhere you can. And that's hard because we're all busy, especially ministers. We're constantly busy. The kids are busy with sports, activities. Everyone is busy. But if we're serious about it, if we're intentional about it, about long-term spiritual growth, this model is always worth considering.
You know, that's right. And here's the thing. I think sometimes churches who have a smaller number do better in this with this model.
Oh,
Right.
I agree 100%.
And it's because, and I'm not trying to knock big churches. I'm not trying to, knock small churches. I'm just trying to make an observation. Sometimes bigger churches struggle with this because they're used to these big numbers, and this model feels slow.
Yeah.
And for big churches, for churches who have a larger number in their youth group, it is super easy for the other kids who are not receiving this direct attention to feel left out.
Yes.
And so we've got to be careful on how we model this and how we do this, and make sure that we're evenly spreading this
marinara sauce.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that's weird. But but in the long
I'm
run,
thinking about pasta.
you're thinking about pasta.
Yeah, I'm really hungry.
In the long run, this model produces deep faith.
Yes.
Right? And it's not about just getting 100 kids in the room. It's about making sure that the 10 that are already in the room leave the room with a deeper faith.
Yes.
And they're
I 100% agree with that. And yeah, I mean, what you said. Yeah, I agree with that. All right.
And disclaimer real quick. All of these three models that we're going to talk about, we're not going to do a really big deep dive into them. We're just kind of going to glaze the surface of them and kind of talk about them. There's some resources that we can provide later on that really deep dive into these different models. Just let us know.
Yeah, don't hesitate. Reach out to us. We're having a speed tour of all these.
A speed real talk.
Speed real talk. All right. Next up is probably one of my favorite models, and it's the event-driven model.
Of course.
This one is focused on big events, right? It's focused on camps. It's focused on retreats. It's focused on your worship nights. It's focused on high-energy experiences.
And here's the thing. I think all of us at some level grew up in youth ministry with this model, right? We are always on the go. We're always doing something. And there's something powerful about that, right? It's not just that these big things are what define our ministry. There's something special within those big moments
Yes.
that the kids can grow together because of this high impact moment.
Absolutely. These events can serve as great entry points for some people. But the challenge is making sure that it leads to real discipleship. I almost said discipline there. That's not the word I need. Discipleship. But, our youth groups, I could speak for my youth group. I can't really speak for yours. But we have a lot of visitors. My kids always bring friends with them. And sometimes they bring them to a fun event. And then next thing I know, they're in church on Sunday morning. They're in church on Wednesday night Bible class. So that's an entry point for these kids. It's not just about emotional highs either. Some events that we have, like retreats, you leave retreats with an emotional high. If your entire ministry is built around events, your kids do get excited. But are you actually helping them grow?
Right.
What are you doing on those events to help them grow?
Right. And so I would argue every church needs to have a follow-up plan after these really big events, right? And otherwise, if they don't, kids are going to leave a weekend fired up, but Monday's coming, right? That next Monday's coming when they're at school, and then the next Tuesday's coming. And so what are you as a youth minister, what are you doing as a volunteer, as a deacon or whatever? What are you doing to help connect what that a big event taught to impact the kids' lives forever? Does that make sense?
It does. Sorry, excuse me. And I've also seen it happen so many times as well. There's a student that has a mountaintop experience at camp, right? Maybe it's your first time at camp and you're like, man, I love this. I'm going to come back next year. Or maybe it's an emotional mountaintop experience. They're crying, worshiping, ready to change their life. And then 2 weeks later, nothing's different, right? There's two different experiences here. That's not necessarily because the event failed, but because the church didn't necessarily do anything after to disciple them, to help them with that growth.
Josh, this reminds me. If you don't know me, I love plants. Okay,
Don't you?
I have legitimately. I probably have 25 plants in my house.
Some would say that he has a problem.
Like, it is awesome. Okay, you walk into my house and it's a rainforest. But here's why I say that.
He's not joking.
Here's why I say that. It's almost like watering and planting a seed, right? I'm currently right now, I've taken a piece of my philodendron ring of fire and I have tried to propagate it. And thank you, Josh, for laughing at that. Thank you, Josh.
I don't understand what those mean, just letting you know. That's why I'm laughing at them.
But it's almost like I take it off and I put it in water to root, but that's it.
Yeah.
I don't actively look after it. I can't just hope it grows. I've got to actually take care of it. You've got to nurture it. Events are really great for planting these seeds in teenagers and in young adults and in everybody. But real spiritual growth happens when we water those seeds that those big events planted. And that's up to the local congregation and leadership to help do.
Yes. Another... Sorry, I'm getting choked up this morning. Another thing that I've learned in these events, they can unintentionally set a bar for what real faith looks like. If a student starts to believe that faith is only, feels real when those lights are low, the music's loud, the crowd is big, they can struggle in the quiet, everyday moments of faith, right? And that's dangerous. That's dangerous for them.
That's good. That's good. We don't want to accidentally teach our students and our kids and our teenagers that the only time God shows up is at a retreat or a conference or whatever, right? He is present in the quiet time at home. He's present when they're walking the hallway. God is present in all of these. And we need to make sure that our kids understand that.
Yeah. I did a Bible class the other day, and I want to say what I told my kids. It really, really kind of ties into what you said right there. Jesus is always working, right? Sometime, God does his best work in the middle of a mess.
Mm-hmm.
In the middle of a mess. Not before it, not after it, but right in the middle, when you're doubting, when you're crying, when you're questioning, when you're struggling, when you're fearful. It's always happened. Another challenge as well, to kind of bounce off of that and go to a different direction. Another challenge is cost. We don't want to accidentally, that's a different line. Another challenge is cost. These events do take a lot of money. It takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of volunteers. Not every church has the resources to pull off a big event so regularly. So if this is your main model for your youth ministry, you're constantly in planning mode, which can lead to that burnout, not only for you as a youth minister, but it leads to burnout for your kids and for your parents because they're constantly dishing out money to go on a fun trip. Not that they're not having a good time, but sometimes that hurts the billfold.
Right. I mean, it is easy, Josh, to spend thousands of dollars on camp.
Oh, yes.
You've not done anything yet. Right? Retreats are the exact same way. And so, and I'm not trying to say that, hey, this is not an avenue worth pursuing, but I am advocating for we need to be intentional and we need to be resourceful. And we
Yes.
need to be good stewards of our money. I think that's biblical. And so even in our youth ministries, we need to be stewards with our money. And I want to also make a disclaimer. If your youth ministry program or your church is blessed with these resources to go on these events, doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to everything. You know what I mean? Because again, you need to be good stewards of God's money. And sometimes I think ministries and youth ministers try to compete with each other and with the world, making things bigger and bigger. Listen, youth ministry's goal is not to entertain. It's to equip for discipleship.
Yes. Preach.
And big events should never replace the regular rhythm of equipping disciples. It should never replace teaching and discipleship. And if our big events have, we need to take a step back and reevaluate.
That being said, when used in the right way, events are and can be incredible tools.
That's right.
Exposure, CYC, EU, Russia, FHU. These are all amazing things. Not saying that, going back to what Caleb said, not saying that you have to go to every single one of them, because all of them in their own ways are remarkable. They're great. I've been to all 4 of them, and I love how they're done. I've had students that have made real decisions for Christ at retreats. Not my personal students, but I've worked with students that have made decisions like that. I've seen friendships and bonds that have formed at camp that completely changed a student's church experience.
That's right. And events can give momentum, right? Sometimes students invite their friends for a fun event or this big event, the friend comes back and they start this momentum drive. It can be an evangelistic tool if we're intentional about making it that evangelistic tool. Listen, big events are phenomenal when they're in their right place.
The bottom line, events are not the enemy.
That's right.
They just can't be the only thing. Pairing them with a discipleship plan, small groups, or mentorship can help those turn into emotional highs into spiritual habits.
And that's the point of this episode, Josh, really, is this idea that you shouldn't have just one individual plan. You've got to have a mix of them all. Almost like a church potluck, right? You've got to combine them all.
Speaking of a church potluck, I'm glad you said that. Guess what I did the other day?
What did you do?
So, being the youth minister, there's always a lot of leftovers. And so I always get told to take food home. So I took home a big to-go plate of spaghetti and hash brown casserole.
Wait a minute. You put them all together?
Yeah, and I'm gonna do you one better. I was doing my dishes at the time, so I didn't want to dirty up another plate, so I got a big bowl. And I just put spaghetti in it, put hash brown casserole in
No,
it,
you didn't.
and I
No, you
just
didn't.
mixed
No,
it
you,
together.
Josh.
You know what I called it? Hash brown casserole with spaghetti.
Hash spaghetti.
Dude, hash spaghetti?
No.
Yes, I didn't even think of that. Hash
Josh,
spaghetti. I
Josh,
made
that
hash
is
spaghetti.
that is terrible.
Look, don't knock it till you try it.
Oh,
All
I'm
right.
knocking. I am
Sometimes
knocking.
the weirdest concoctions that you can make are
That is so
sometimes the
gross,
best.
Josh.
All right. All right. Just say it. All right. Moving on. Moving on.
Josh, okay, with you and your weird food analogies and habits, have you ever seen the movie The Incredibles?
Have I seen the movie Incredibles? Honey, where's my super suit? Yes,
Okay.
I've seen The Incredibles.
Okay, so you remember there's an episode, or there's an episode of The Incredibles.
Episode? No, they didn't have episodes. They had movies.
There's a scene in The Incredibles, Josh, that is, so you know they're trying to settle into real life because superheroes and superpowers have now been deemed illegal, right?
Correct.
Okay, well, so they're trying to settle in, and Mrs. Incredible is trying to have this family dinner. Bob's off doing whatever Bob's wanting to do, and so the family starts sitting down trying to have a meal together. And there's a fight that ensues, and Mrs. Incredible calls for Bob, and what does Bob say?
Children, listen to your mom. Something like
Right?
that.
Something like that, right? And then there's a fight that ensues and everything like that. Now, what is Mrs. Incredible looks at Bob and says, Bob, it's time to engage. Don't just stand there.
And then he picks up the table. He goes, "This is engaged."
This is me engaging, right? And the doorbell rings and everything stops.
Yeah.
Now, why do I bring this up?
What model is this?
I think this leads us to our family integrated model, this family ministry model, right? And I think because a lot of the times what happens is our families feel the need to be chaotic. Not feel the need to be chaotic, but they are chaotic and they don't know how to not be. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
And so perhaps in some youth ministry programs and some church programs, the leaders are looking at their parents and saying, it is time for you to engage.
Yes.
And so that leads us to the family ministry, the family integrated model. It's a big shift from how youth ministry has been traditionally done. Okay. Instead of separating students into their own ministry, their own groups, this prioritizes families discipling their own kids.
Yes. This is
English.
Yeah, English, I know, right? That's what happens when you don't go to college. This model is really built around Deuteronomy chapter 6. Parents teaching faith at home. You know, youth ministers in this model work more as coaches for parents rather than just leaders for their students, right?
Yep.
And this can be a big game changer because if we're honest, parents have the biggest influence on their kids.
That's right.
On their kids' faith in that case. If we equip their parents, we're setting the students up for a faith that lasts beyond graduation. Because let's be completely honest, right? We only spend 5-6 hours a week with our kids.
And that's being generous.
And that's being generous, right? We don't get a lot of time with them. And, you know, obviously, when you look at the broad scheme from sixth grade to 12th grade, you have a lot of time with them. But sometimes your parents have the most time to help them. So
that's right. And this is a strong and very biblical approach because it leads to long-term faith, right? And let's be honest, it is tough to shift a culture of a church, right? It is.
It's true.
And so if your ministry has a history and a culture of being more traditional it is really difficult to bring this model into practice, but it needs to be done.
Yes. Not every family is equipped to lead spiritually. And that's okay. That's okay. So this is where our youth ministers come into play. Youth ministers in this model have to be intentional about equipping their parents. Put in the effort to say, hey, do you want to be a chaperone on this trip?
Mm-hmm.
And then basically, without completely telling them this is what you're doing, you're teaching them how to actually do this at home.
Yeah.
If a church is going to take this approach, they have to make sure they're providing the right resources for these parents, training these parents, encouraging the parents. There's no reason, and this is my belief, this is my opinion, there's no reason that a youth minister should deny their parents access to go on a trip, especially if they want to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if they want to be involved. Now, deacons, on the other hand, a lot of the deacons for Over Youth Ministry have kids in the youth group. And so even those deacons, and this is going to be next week's episode, we're going to talk about deacons as well. But deacons sometimes have the most, what's the word I'm looking for? The most influence on the parents, because they're parents just as much. Right. Caleb and I are not parents. Obviously, we're not married and all that. So sometimes our deacons are able to do more than what we can, and we have to acknowledge that sometimes.
That's right. And Josh, here's the thing: youth ministry is constantly evolving, right?
Correct.
You think of this. 5 years ago, youth ministry was done completely different. And you think of how COVID has influenced youth ministry and churches and culture, and how that has affected the way that we do it. Similarly, the leaders of youth ministry programs have got to be able to adapt.
Right.
And so how we view every model and how we incorporate every model has to be able to go through evaluation for the sake of our kids and our congregation.
And sometimes we have to reevaluate certain situations.
That's right.
Sometimes things are going to work, and sometimes things are going to go kaput.
Right.
And that's just what's going to happen. And as a youth minister, we have to know how to reevaluate what's going to work for my kids, what's not going to work for my kids, and only you as a youth minister can know what's best for your kids.
That's right. And sometimes something may be going great and may be going good, but we can make it better by doing something different.
Yeah, maybe come back to it.
Exactly. And just being able to think critically about every situation is super important.
Correct.
And as a youth ministers, we've got to be able to do that.
Yes.
So I guess here's the thing. Every church is different. And what works for one group might not work for the other one. The key is to know your students, your church's culture, and your leadership strengths.
Correct. And don't be afraid to adjust either. You might start with one model and realize, hey, it's not completely working. You need to reevaluate. You need to tweak it. Because at the end of the day, the goal is the same for every youth minister. And that's helping our students grow in their faith, grow in equipping them for a long life of leadership and discipleship. At the end of the day, I think a youth minister's goal is to see their kids being active in the church 5 to 10 years after they're out of the youth group. Even more, but you want to constantly see your kids in their faith.
That's right.
Active in their faith.
That's right. Well, Josh, I think that's a wrap for today. To those listening or watching, we hope that this discussion on youth ministry models and structures has been helpful and that it has encouraged you.
Yes. And if you have enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the Ministry League on YouTube, share it with a fellow youth leader, and leave us a review. Leave us some comments, some questions. Maybe we can somehow integrate those into one of our episodes.
That's right. And here's the thing. If you've got a model that we didn't talk about that is working for you and your ministry, we'd love to hear about it and how it's working for you and everything. So reach out to us on social media and tell us all about it because we'd love to hear it.
Well, That's all we got for today. Thanks for hanging out with us today. We'll see you next week on Real Talk Youth Ministry with Josh and Caleb.
Bye.